Welcome, everyone, to the first in a series of weekly virtual conferences addressing the challenge of rehousing Ukraine. I'm David Smith. I'm the founder of the Affordable Housing Institute, and I am honored beyond measure at the opportunity to talk with all of you and to introduce the esteemed moderator and panel. Just a little bit about AHI. We are a global nonprofit consultancy that believes that stable, adequate housing is critical to post-crisis recovery, post-disaster recovery. We've worked in the field of natural disasters in a number of countries around the world. This is the first time we're dealing with disaster caused by aggression. But the principles of recovery are similar, and it is a continuum between relief and redevelopment. We also know that recovery benefits when local knowledge, local priorities, local experience are fused and connected to experiences in other countries around the world. We started on the journey of creating this conference series because as soon as it became clear we were dealing with a major invasion, it also became clear that housing would have to be an essential part of the recovery and rebuilding afterwards. Affordable housing does not just happen as a benefit of market success. In fact, in many ways, a rapidly recovering economy makes housing less affordable. So that even though housing is where jobs and families and children go to sleep safely at night and the foundation of a society, it's very hard to do right, and it's very hard to do right fast. In my experience, the best way to predict the future is to invent it and to channel what you know will be coming in ways that benefit Ukraine. Because as you will see, in certain ways, the first day of rebuilding is already here. You'll hear from Dmitry Chasovnikov about what folks are doing in his part of Ukraine and the challenges he's facing. People will act, they will move, they will build, they will repair, and they need positive help because that force is unstoppable. In this series, we're trying to bring both international and Ukrainian voices, and for this first panel, we are giving primary voice to the Ukrainians. We will have additional weekly conferences, one a week from today at this exact same time, on the returnees and how one builds better, smarter, faster, and fairer. And then 2 weeks hence, we will talk about the refugee situation, people who are outside the country and who will not come home for some time, and how they figure into the overall rehousing of Ukraine. There may be more in this series. The World Urban Forum is being held between June 26th and June 30th in Katowice in Poland, not far from most of you. We will be there. We believe that the rehousing of Ukraine will become a conversation topic in the World Urban Forum. We currently plan additional panels and virtual conferences in the series on the far side of the World Urban Forum, but we're guided by your level of interest and by whether, in fact, a convening such as this creates the opportunity for value additive sharing of knowledge, insight, experience, capital, action, and support. Again, I could not be more honored to be participating in this and to have the privilege of hosting it. I'm going to turn it over now to our esteemed moderator, Alexei Filiv of INTEGRITES. Alexei, over to you. Thank you.
Дякую, David.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to welcome you as well. My name is Alexei Filiv. I am the managing partner of the legal company INTEGRITES, and I have the honor to be the co-moderator today of our first panel about the first day of our reconstruction starts, the situation, priorities and challenges. Today we have distinguished people at this panels who are going to be participating throughout the day. They represent different segments. There are representatives of the state authorities, there are representatives of the civic society organizations and initiatives. We also have the research institutions joining us as well. So basically, out of the 5 speakers that we have today, we would like to receive the full picture about how do they see the challenges of the reconstruction and rehousing Ukraine? What are the challenges that the rehousing and reconstruction is going to pose in front of people? And what should be the time frame for the reconstruction in those processes? So try to be very brief. Before we pass the floor to our first speaker, I would like to remind all of our participants that we would like to have this discussion interactive. So please, if you have any comments or questions, let us know in the chat. The comments are going to be selected and moderated, and they're going to be then passed to me, and I will be able to ask those questions to our distinguished speakers. And I would like to pass the floor to our first speaker, Nataliya Khotsianivska. Nataliya is the Deputy Minister of the Development of Communities and Territories of Ukraine, and I would like to ask Nataliya to tell us about the challenges that they see for the rebuilding of Ukraine as of today. Nataliya, please.
Доброго дня, шановні
Good
учасники.
afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants of the conference. The discussion of the offered topics and challenges are very important for Ukraine because the problems are relevant and timely. We're really grateful for the significant support that has already been provided by the international organizations, and we appreciate your support and aid provision for Ukraine in this harsh period of Ukrainian history. Our state today is going to be checking out for the cost to be effectively spent, especially when we're talking about the restoration and additional construction of the infrastructure of Ukraine. And when we're talking about the safety of the objects that have been developed and constructed with the help of state financial support or private money, we do understand that this question is very relevant as of today. As of now, almost 3 million of Ukrainians have become the internally displaced persons and have been assigned as internally displaced persons since the full-scale invasion of Russian Federation. I'm not going to be mentioning those tremendous numbers of the housing that has been partially damaged isn't possible to be used right now. More than thousands of Ukrainian families are now left homeless and without housing. That is why it is very important for us to rebuild or reconstruct the housing according to the modern effective technologies that will provide a safer housing for the people.
Yes, Natalia, we're really, really sorry for interrupting you. We're really sorry, but please, can we ask you to choose the Ukrainian channel in the interpretation? Because our international speakers aren't able to hear you
Він у
in the
мене
same channel.
обраний.
Yes, this is the channel
Він
that
у
has
мене
been chosen.
обраний
Yes, that has
українська,
been
так?
chosen. Okay, that's strange.
Що додати?
Давайте запитаємо наших
Let us maybe ask our speakers.
the translation.
А вони чують, але
Just
там
let us know. Can you hear the interpretation? But we know that the channels are overlapping. So that was basically the problem. You might try to pinch. There is mute the original audio. You can try to mute the original audio. That might help.
Давайте я тоді не буду обтяжувати.
So maybe then I'm not going to be. And Natalia has muted her microphone.
Да. А може хтось з технічної підтримки розмютити, тому що
Can we
очевидно.
just maybe unmute Natalia's microphone because it seems that we have some kind of a problem. Can we just unmute her?
Yes.
Yes, please, Natalia. So, terribly sorry. Yes, we had some technical issues as well. So, basically, at this very moment, I would try to wrap up in my introductory speech. I would like to wish you all the best. I would like to wish you all the productive work during the conference. And once again, thank you so much to all of our participants. Thank you so much for joining this very important deed for Ukraine and very important initiative for Ukraine on rehousing of Ukraine and restoration of Ukraine as well. Thank you so much.
Yes, Natalia, but can we then ask some questions, because you are the representatives of our regulator, because your ministry is going to be basically responsible for the reconstruction of our state. So does the ministry and regulators work in order to synchronize all of the construction norms and standards with the European norms? We know that the procedure has started quite a long time ago, but we would like to know whether the procedure is continuing during the war, so that the reconstruction can be held according to the most contemporary, the most effective, and the most environmental friendly standards.
Yes. Yes, right, you are. The Ministry of Regional Development has already been working on that, and we have already registered it with the Parliament of Ukraine, and in the first hearing they've already approved the 7282 draft law that presupposes the complex program on restoration of our regions, 7198 draft law on the reconstruction of the damaged housing. With those draft laws, they do presuppose the additional amendment to the state construction norms that presuppose the obligatory basis of creation additional security objects when you're planning during the original design of the city planning, and especially when you're constructing the residential housings.
I think that I will then switch to our next speaker on the panel, and I think that I would like to invite Dmytro Chasovnikov, because Dmytro is the head of the initiative group for the housing for the educators in Mariupol, and he is one of those representatives who's going to share his personal experience about the situation on the ground. So what is the situation that we have with the IDPs? Or what do we have with the people that we currently call twice IDPs? Because we know that there was a lot of people who have left to Mariupol from the temporarily occupied territories of Donetsk and Lugansk regions, and now they had to once again move from Mariupol as well. Dmytro, the floor is yours. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dmytro Chasovnikov. I am a citizen of Ukraine, and due to the Russian aggression, I have turned myself into twice internally displaced person. I have been working in the state institution, and I've also had been continuing my educator's work in the university. And I would like to share the two main points with you today during my presentation. I wanted to express some ideas about the events that I have seen starting from 2014. And the second part of my presentation would be about telling you about what has happened to our community as a result of the military aggression in 2022 as well. And I would like to start my presentation with what David Smith has said, because, to be isolated is terrible, but to be ignored is as scary as to be isolated. So, every person might face really terrible challenges that you cannot overcome without any additional help. And as of today, as the result of the Russian offense towards Ukraine, we know that there's many people who have got to this situation, my family and many other families all over Ukraine. I think you might know that starting from 2014, the illegally military formations, with the support of the regular army of the Russian Federation, we've had territories in Lugansk and Donetsk region that have been temporarily occupied. In the same time, the patriotic citizens of Ukraine that were forced to leave their houses, their apartments. They were forced to leave those territories in order to, first of all, save themselves, save their lives, save their children, avoid violence acts against them, and to provide the functioning of the enterprises and companies and organizations that they have been working before. And the most important thing in this case, that they wanted to preserve their community in a safe place. So that place for us at some point of time was Mariupol. A lot of people from Donetsk region moved to Mariupol because Mariupol was the biggest and the most developed, industrially and culturally developed city of our region. And when we have been displaced, the families have been displaced, colleagues have been displaced, the friends have been displaced, we've started to build a new community and building up the new acquaintances. In order to preserve our existing community and in order to be integrated into the hosting community, we've tried to resolve the most important questions. And for example, receiving additional premises for us to be positioned in our organizations and offices, providing the needed equipment and providing the needed housing for all of our employees as well. We used to start with the dorms. In 8 years that we have lived, that our community has lived in Mariupol, with our own efforts, and mostly with our own efforts, and with the support of the local community and the local authorities, with the support of the international organization, we will manage to assimilate. They have provided the needed help for the IDPs, and we were able to restore our everyday activities. We'll be able to restore our everyday activities, and we were able to restore our life that we've left behind at the temporarily occupied territories. I'm not going to mention those state programs that were available to support the IDPs because there's many, but we have tried to apply for those programs in order for us to receive our own residential housing so that we would be able to establish our own family life as well. But it didn't turn out like that, and it wasn't about the resources were not really available for the IDPs in Ukraine. It's not that we didn't have enough resources from 2014 to 2022. We know that we have limited in financial support from the budget, but in 2022, the biggest reason was the aggressive offense of the Russian Federation military against Ukraine. The broad offense that has started on the 24th of February 2022, the one that has been supported by the global shellings and bombardments, caused the death of thousands of civilians in Mariupol city, and it destroyed multiple infrastructure objects as well. During those shellings, we were forced for the second time in the last 10 years to be evacuated with only the things that are basically needed. Our displacements in 2014 and then the second displacement in 2022, that is something that destroys community. It takes down the connections that you've had. It destroys your ways of income. It destroys your savings as well. But the most acute and relevant question that we have seen both in 2014 and the question that is still acute and relevant in 2022 for the IDPs is the problems with housing. Because millions of people are aware of how hard it is. Dmytro, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but Dmytro, you have presentation as well. Would you like to share that? Yes, I would like to. I would like to share that like 3 minutes more and I will turn on the presentation. The presentation is the second part. So like everything works fine with you. Like, well, it was, I hope. I hope that I still have some time to do the presentation as well. So just, yes, thank you for this reminding. It's just that the one thing that I wanted to say, before that, wanted to do this kind of intro when they just show you with pictures and in the presentation and show you a couple of examples later on. So yes, so housing has been the most relevant problem. To earn money to build your own house or to buy your own apartment, that's really painful. Especially it's really painful for the people who work for the society welfare. And it's really relevant for educators, for social workers, for state officers. And additionally, there will also be the people who have been twice displaced in this decade. It is important to say that you don't need nuclear bombs, or you don't need the missiles to destroy the nation. You just have to decrease the education level. To destroy a nation, you have to destroy their education system. So I do see this in work. So, right now I'm going to be talking about these personal examples because, the Mariupol City Lyceum that I represent as the head of the initiative group, we all have come together and we're trying to do everything that's possible in order to preserve our educational institutions, by evacuating our educators, evacuating our pupils and their families to the safe territories. We're trying to conduct the online classes as well, but we know that our main goal is to continue teaching children offline at the safe territories, and we've decided that we're going to be displaced to Kyiv. We're trying to preserve our community. We're trying to support one another with money, with ideas, with emotional or financial support as much as possible. And that was the way how we've got to this organization that has been created. We're trying to integrate into our hosting community in Kiev. People are going to be very persistent in order to preserve their communities and in order to organize their life in the new locations. We're trying to support and help one another. But in this process, it is very important to receive the aid from people who care, organizations or governmental institutions, or even the government of other countries. We understand that all of the power and all of the efforts of the volunteers at the state institutions of Ukraine are currently dedicated to the military forces of Ukraine. So we understand today that's a very relevant issue about the external financial support that is needed for us to be able to restore our housing, to rebuild our houses, to rebuild our flats, and to preserve our cities. You know, the main goal for ourselves and the main goal for our organizations, because how we can put it, you know, the life, family, your home, and your community. Those will be the main values for our organization. And for the second part of my presentation and my time, I would like to share a presentation with you, and I would like to show you and show all of the people who have joined us today. Wanted to show you what was happening in Mariupol, using our community as an example in a very narrow understanding of this community, talking about our teachers, our educators. Just let me give me a second. Just give me a second.
Технічне є питання, є.
Дмитро, ми бачимо, так, можна.
Yes, Dmitro, we can see your presentation. Well, you can see my presentation, hopefully. Okay, I will try to make it full screen. Just a second.
Ну, вибачаюсь, що в такому вигляді.
So I'm sorry that is going to be in that format. I just don't want to waste your time. So we'll just hope that it will be okay for you to read the presentation like that. So, you know, the war is, and this is one of the ideas of our organization that we have understood for ourselves, that it's basically the cold steel word that causes ruins, that causes hunger and death. But there's important because it highlights the most important values: family, home, and people. So we have had this information from the official resources, and you can see that about the Mariupol city. So you can see how many are displaced persons inside of Ukraine. So more than 430,000 people that used to live on the territory of Mariupol. Right now, more than 1/3 of those people have become the internally displaced persons. Most of them are located in the central Ukraine, part of them in the west of Ukraine, and you can see that 1/3 is being currently located in the neighboring regions closer to Mariupol. We have also collected the real photos and the real stories of the people, and you know that this were the real houses. For example, one of the teachers, the math teacher, the teacher of Ukrainian language, this is her house and her words. God, you're sending those challenges to us, but how can we go through those challenges? We do hope that soon I will walk to my houses, but not to the house that the good people have let me in, but I hope that I will be able to have my own home, that I will feel the coziness of my own home. God, give me strength. So each slide that we have made in this presentation and each of the stories that we have collected, those were the real stories. And all of those stories, they speak about this feeling of home as the key stage, the key stage of building our community, the main brick in building our community. For example, the teacher, the physics teacher, he has been also awarded with a state award for his educating experience. He says that he wants to continue teaching pupils. He wants to see the people who loved ones that he has lost due to the war. He wants to get back to his big family table. He wants to live again. So I'm not going to read out through all of those stories and through all of the slides, because you can see there are the real human stories behind that. There's many stories like that. We just selected a couple of the stories of the people that we know. But I would like to summarize my presentation by saying, by using the very same words that we used in the end of our presentation, that we do believe that Ukraine will stand through that, and we know that the cities will be rebuilt. We just need some time and support to do that. Everything will be Ukraine. Thank you very much for your attention.
Дякуємо, Дмитро.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dmytro.
Будь ласка,
You can now stop sharing your screen.
І з вашого дозволу,
Yes, and if you may,
буде коротке питання.
is that's one thing that I wanted to ask you very briefly. The first question that I would like to have, and
Де ви почали знову
in your experience from 2014 to 2022, when basically you have started your new life in Mariupol after 2014, what was the hardest thing for you in this process of restoring your life and in this process of,
почати жити в новому
starting to live in a new city, even in the very same region when you've left Donetsk region, from the point of view of an IDP? What was it that you have seen? What was the hardest on this way in 2014, 2022? The hardest thing was here is about to preserving as much as people as possible, to get as much as possible people displaced to the secure communities. The second stage was not about the work, it was not about employment, it was not about, it wasn't that much of, restoring your family connections or your colleagues' connection, but, it was about having your own place to stay, your home. So I think that this is the first stage that helps you to restart your life from wherever you are. So this is the first steps that gives you the opportunity to re-establish your life under new conditions.
То ви поставили навіть
So
збереження
you would even say that, preserving the community, as far as I've heard you, even before restoring housing. So, housing, but still preserving the community that you've had, is it? Well, yes, basically, yes, with people with the community that you've had before. But this is something that was happening, like from my experience, when you're talking about the IDPs, when you're working about the collective, the place and employment, your job, the next stage, it would be, the displacement of your relatives, of your friends, of people who are there with you in this, finding the new people in the new hosting community, building your own community, and integration to the hosting community as well. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dmytro. I think that's definitely going to be the big challenge for Ukraine, not only to provide the restoration and reconstruction of Ukraine, but also to preserve these collectives, preserving communities as well. Because, well, yes, and I would like to add up to that, because, in 2014, we've had, again, displaced our working collective, and we've had one collective that has been displaced in 2014. Right now, we're displacing the collective in 2022 edition. But basically, what we're aiming for is to preserve the job, so your working collective, and to give them some place to stay, to live, so build up their home, so they would be able to restore their life, to restore their housing, to restore their life again. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dmytro. I see that you
але насправді це дуже
haven't
емоційне.
been very emotional throughout your presentation, but those are very emotional stories. So thank you very much for sharing those stories with us. And I see that in the chats, we had a number of questions coming about, first of all, of whether we're going to make the presentation available and whether the recording of this conversation is going to be available. Yes, Dear audience, after all of our presentation, you will be able to receive the recording and you will also receive the access to our speaker's presentation. So please do not worry if we are trying sometimes to pace up because of the time limitations, but if you would be interested in reading that out, especially for our next speaker, who has a lot of statistical data in her presentation. So please do not worry, you will have the opportunity to take a deeper look into her presentation as well. But we will try to concentrate on the most important moments in our spoken conversation. So that is why I would like to invite our next speaker. Please welcome Darina Marchak, who is the head of the Center for Analyzing the Public Finances in Public Management. So from Kyiv School of Economy, and Darina is going to tell us about the key problems of the housing fund of Ukraine in figures. I think that we're all aware of those problems, but in figures, that would be definitely interesting for us to see that. Darina, the floor is yours. Hello, dear colleagues. It's a pleasure for me to be able to participate in this conference. I really would like to ask the organizers to turn my presentation on the screen. I don't have these technical capacities, unfortunately, to say that, okay, it's not, there is some kind of a gray spot on the screen. That's, well, now I see that very nice. So maybe there's, okay, so I hope that works good, but there has been some kind of a gray spot. Yes, let us just do it again. Let us re-upload the presentation again. Okay, right now it seems working. Yes, thank you very much.
Just because my presentation is in English, I do not want to switch from language to language when talking about the issue. But if I do not manage to find some right words, please help me, colleagues. As well, besides my focus with public finances, which is my usual job before the war, starting with February 25, the next day the war has started, we began a volunteer project, which is called Russia Will Pay. It's an official name. We believe in this message. But the goal of the project is triple, I would say. Could you please switch to another slide? Наступний слайд. Да. Дякую. So this project was started with support of Office of the President and Ministry of Economy of Ukraine, and it targeted a number of issues. So first aim was to gather information. I think that nobody in Ukraine expected the scale and the amount of damages, and we were quite naive at the very beginning and considered that we will manage to calculate, to count any single damage that happened. But simultaneously, we began to make damage assessment of those assets available, publicly available, with the information about damages. And this actually became one of the primary focus of the project as of now. The third goal is to support business and government in understanding how to proceed with legal issues on this track, how to get compensation from the aggressor country. But it's out of the focus of my presentation right now. So the major job that we are doing right now is gathering information from both public sources like media, statements of regional authorities, Office of the President, and so on. And also it's working very closely with government of Ukraine in developing methodology, how to make damage assessment and losses and now needs assessment, and to make assessment itself. And starting from March, we are making on a weekly basis updates on the amount of damages that Ukraine has has suffered due to the Russian war. And today, actually, we are going to make the new release, so you will see the latest figures. We are working mostly with indirect methods of assessment, as most of us understand that we have no possibility to access sites of damages in Mariupol or Severodonetsk or Lysychansk or other cities. That is why we use statistical data to make this kind of assessment. Still on those territories where available, for example, in Irpin, Bucha, in Hostomel, we are using object-by-object calculations. As well, we are using satellite and drone images data to analyze the exact percentage of destruction in each particular city where such images are available. Could you please move to another slide? Наступний слайд, будь ласка. And another one. I will not go in details through methodology. I think that everyone will be able to look it through if interested. Наступний слайд. Дякую. So when talking in general about damages in Ukraine caused by Russian war, as of now, our estimates is about $104 billion US. It's the replacement cost. It's not the market value of the damaged and ruined assets. And important note is that first, we do not include in these estimates those assets that are located on the temporary occupied territories. We only include those assets that are damaged or ruined. And another important note is that we do not assess here those damages that happened before February 24th this year. That is, we do not include anything, any damages caused since 2014 by Russian aggression. The next slide. Thank you. On this slide, you can see the major figures on the structure, sectoral structure of the damage. And as you can see, there are two major parts of this structure. First is infrastructure damages, mostly road infrastructure, but as well here we count railroads and airports infrastructure and so on. And the second biggest part is residential buildings and housing. Altogether, this amount is about $80 billion US, with other assets like social infrastructure, medical, healthcare capacities, educational institutions, and so on, counting for another $24 billion US. And on the next slide, we can finally see some statistics. Please move to another slide, to the next one. Thank you. So on this slide, you can actually find information about what is focus of our topic today. It's residential damages estimates. And as you can see, you have a very big relation between those territories that are most affected by war and by active where active battlefields are situated right now, and the cities with the biggest amount of the destroyed residential buildings. The leader, unfortunately, is Mariupol due to the size of the city and the level of damages. The second one is Kharkiv due to the size of the city, although Kharkiv is not damaged to as high degree as Mariupol, but it's one of the biggest Ukrainian cities. So the level of damages of around 30% of residential buildings makes these figures really big. And then you have Chernihiv, Severodonetsk, and other cities. And here you can see the financial estimates of these damages, but on another slide you can find the same breakdown, but already with millions of square meters. Thank you. As of today, the total assessment of residential buildings loss in Ukraine is about 44.8 around 45 million square meters in Ukraine, with total value of the damaged assets around $40 billion. And as well here you can see that the biggest losses are in Donetsk region, Kharkiv, Lugansk, Chernihiv, and Kiev regions without city of Kiev. And the most important is that in total, according to our calculations, around 860,000 Ukrainian families has lost their housing due to all these destructions. Important note is that we cannot calculate right now which particular part of this buildings is damaged to the level which allows reparation of the house, and houses that could not be repaired at all. But according to the World Bank methodology, which is used by our team as a basis for the calculations, the housing or any other building is considered to be able to repair if it's if the level of damage is less than 40% of the building. If you have more than 40% of the building damaged, experts consider this building not capable for rebuilding, and it should be demolished fully and built from scratch. Also, in these calculations, we count the cost of the buildings themselves. We also count repair costs, but we do not count, for example, the furniture, the techniques in the houses, and so on. So if we add here the equipment in all these houses, the sum will be obviously much bigger. I would skip the next slide and move to this one. Thank you. These calculations are approximate. The bigger accurate data on the damages we have, the more accurate estimates are done. And one of these methods to get this accuracy is to get satellite or drone images. We have already made such work for 4 Kiev region cities, and here you can see the detailed figures on the losses in these cities. For example, Horenka, Mashun, and Pushevaditsa, we are now working on making the same estimate for Irpin city to have the exact number of damaged and ruined buildings and so on. But in general, the figures are really depressing, and we understand that it's not only about the loss of the housing, residential housing, it's also about the movements of enormous amount of people that creates great pressure on Ukrainian social infrastructure, on medical, educational, other infrastructure in those cities that receive the IDPs, as well as cities abroad. So the financial needs for reconstruction are really very, very massive. And the last slide, the next one of mine, is that starting to 2014, the government has invested together with international community a lot of money to rebuild and to help with housing for those IDPs that lost their housing after Russian invasion in 2014. But as you can see on this slide, the sum were rather, how to say, rather small. I'm sorry, I found here one mistake. It's billion not in US dollars, but in Ukrainian hryvnias. Unfortunately, we do not have that amount of money in Ukraine's budget to fund this amount in US dollars. So the funding that was provided before the war was rather small, and the amount of this funding and support will not be ever sufficient to solve the problem of housing for all Ukrainian IDPs that we have right now as a result of the war. Thank you very much. I'm very sorry for being long, and we'll be very glad to answer your questions, if any.
Дякую вам, Дарина, за досить
Thank you very much, Darina, for the very interesting presentation. Thank you very much for trying to stick to a very brief time frame. Thank you very much, for sure. That's very good job that you've done. We have a couple of questions from our participants and a couple of questions that I have as well. But let us start with our participants. The people are asking, what has been the basic price when you have been evaluating 1 square meter, when you have been evaluating the ruined housing? The basic price is changing, so we've been using the decree of Ukrainian government from February 2022 that has proved the overall cost in different regions for the 1 square meters of the residential housing. So those costs would be slightly different, but if we will go to the USD as of rates of February 2022, so that would differ depending on the region. That would be from $300 to up till $600, but the clean cost of construction would be around $500 per square meter. And then again, so what we have calculated as well, and what we have considered as well, we have considered the repair into that, because we understand that it's not just enough for us, to build up a new house and, build up a new building, residential building, and just to give it to the people, because all of the repairs and renovation that you will have to do that, because averagely we understand that it will cost at least 30% of what the apartment will cost to buy. So we have tried to calculate all of our damages with more or less understanding how much the moderate renovation will also take. But in the same time, in this price, in our pricing, in our evaluation, we haven't included all of the needed equipment like the fridges or the TVs and other equipment in the housing. Yes, thank you. We have a couple of brief questions as well. So, Darina, the territories that are currently occupied, when you do not have the access and you have no opportunity to evaluate the damages, I've seen that in Bucha and Irpin you were using drones, and you have also used the satellites. Is it possible to use the satellites imaging in order to evaluate the damages on the temporarily occupied territories? Like, I don't know how the Kyiv School of Economy, your center, had this access to the satellites imaging, but maybe you could give us a couple of words on that. Well, yes, first of all, it's not just the work that we are doing. We're collaborating with the government of Ukraine. We have a decree 326 that identifies that the governmental institutions, they have to develop the methodology on evaluations of the damaged housing. We're consulting all of the governmental institutions on developing this evaluation methodology. And there's also the National Council on Restoration. They also have the group on auditing the damages, and I am the head of the subgroup on evaluating the damages. And in the framework of this subgroup, we have been collaborating effectively with all of the governmental institutions. So it's not just the civic initiative from our side. So I would say that it's, the nationwide work that has been conducted to evaluate the damages properly. So that is why we have the support of our government, especially in providing and receiving this data. We have had the agreement with the Ministry of the Reintegration, with the World Bank, and with the support of the World Bank, we've had the access to the AXA satellites imaging, and we have just received the first satellite imaging from those territories, and I do hope that by the end of June we will be able to have this detailed digitalized information about the biggest cities. And when we're talking about and we will be able to discuss the overall damages. And we're also right now in negotiations with a private-owned company that one is currently providing the evaluation of the damage, and they're providing these images for the specific needs. I'm not going to get you the details on what company and what are the needs, but basically we are in negotiation of exchanging the information with these images. That's a really hard question about these images, because we understand that the priority to provide this kind of satellite images is for the military. You know, for us as the evaluators, we're not in the front line, we're not the first people in the queue, but we already have some progress about that. And by the end of June, we will have the results of working with NASCAR as well. Okay, Darina, the final question, try to be very brief, but in your table and in your presentations, we know that it was about 2.5 billion hryvnias that was spent in 2020 for the IDPs. So there was the figures for 2022. Yes, you know, thank you very much. That's what I've seen in my final slide as well. Maybe I've got the wrong version of the presentation, because for the slide 22, that was a plan. And of course, it was the plan. And in the previous years, we've had the factual use of money. In 2022, that was just the planned financial support that has been planned in the budget for 2022. And right now, all of the non-specialized costs have been cut down in the budget. And I think that these programs on restoring housing in the East are not being financially supported from the budget now. Yes, thank you very much. We have a lot of questions actually, but we need to pass the floor to our next speaker. And I would like to pass the floor to Emily Channell-Justice, who is the head of the research program on studying contemporary Ukraine in Ukrainian Institute of Harvard University. So Emily is going to share with us the historical overview for the last 8 years of how the housing has been provided to the Ukrainian internally displaced persons starting from 2014. Because, you know, the topics that we're currently raising is not a new topic for Ukraine, unfortunately, but we know it has changed its scale. So, Emily, please, the floor is yours. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, all speakers and organizers. I'm going to continue my presentation in English as well. So if you would like to listen, you can listen to the interpretation into Ukrainian.
Thanks for everyone who's attending. So I was working on a research project about internal displacement and the sort of lack of government policy in Ukraine toward internally displaced people over the course of 8 years. So my information is coming from a combination of background research, as well as interviews that I did with experts who are also working on this problem. So just to give a sense, most of the information I'll be giving, or all the information I'll be giving today, is talking about up until February 24th, 2022. So the general sense of internal displacement in Ukraine over the 8 years from 2014 to 2021 counted nearly 1.5 million displaced people from Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, as well as from Crimea. This is the information from the Ministry of Social Policy from the 5th of May of 2021. So that's relatively up to date in terms of what was going on up until the war. You can see that the number is a little bit under 1.5 million people, but it's really important to recognize that the number of registered internally displaced people does not necessarily accurately reflect the actual number of people who are displaced or who are in need of housing. And that's part of, you know, a kind of bigger picture problem of lack of information and lack of data up to the invasion in February 24th that I'll come back to. So there's two key aspects of counting IDPs that was a challenge for Ukraine. many people who left the territories of Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea did not register for official IDP status. That's for a number of reasons. And then the other major issue is that many people who did register as internally displaced people still lived in the occupied territories, the temporarily occupied parts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. And this is, again, for a number of reasons that, people make different decisions about their status, but it's really important for us to remember that even if these official status exists, the official numbers exist, that's not always telling us the whole story. And we have to take this into consideration as we're crafting, policies to help people who are in need, in particularly of housing. So this brings us a couple of major questions for IDPs that, especially related to housing. The question of the status of housing for internally displaced people. So there's two aspects to this question. Internally displaced people, many of them kept the status of internally displaced because that allowed them to continue to claim the housing that they left behind, right? So in order to be able to claim that reparations or any kind of funding to rebuild that housing, people had to remain in internally displaced status. So a person who is internally displaced, in order to continue their claim on their housing, whatever the status of that housing is, remain internally displaced, even at the same time that they're reintegrating into a new community. So they're concerned not only about the status of their homes in the place that they left, but they're also concerned about the status of housing in their host communities. And then the additional question here is the status of housing for people who are still living in the temporarily occupied territories, whether those people are registered as displaced or not. It's important for us to, remember that their housing, these are people who might also be living in damaged housing, or who might even be displaced within the occupied territories because of housing. So this problem of housing was something that was repeatedly the kind of major issue among people that I spoke to. One of the major issues, and Nataliya Khotsianivska is a researcher who's been working on this issue of housing, and she'll be presenting in the third panel. But according to her recent research, some 50,000 properties were damaged or destroyed by the war in Donbass, and that includes 20,000 in the government-controlled territories. But there has not, up until now, been a database that can accurately identify all of the lost or damaged property in the temporarily occupied territories. And because of that, there's no mechanism for the compensation of loss or damage to those properties. There's no legal way to buy or sell properties in the temporarily occupied territories. And of course, there's also this issue of the occupying forces, the illegitimate authorities of the temporarily occupied territories that have taken over or expropriated so-called abandoned properties that are still legally owned by Ukrainian citizens. And so I brought some data that came from the Humanitarian Needs Assessment in 2018. So Nataliya Khotsianivska's research said 50,000 properties damaged or destroyed. This research said 40,000. That's reasonably close. This Humanitarian Needs Assessment also addressed winterization, not having enough winter supplies. Whether that's because of damage from the war or just generally access to resources. This is also a housing question. And third, as I mentioned, the question of IDPs trying to afford housing and housing security in their current residential areas. So we really do have these two different aspects of concern in terms of housing for internally displaced people up until 2022. What the Ministry of the Reintegration of the Temporarily Occupied Territories had been working on compensation for housing, lost and destroyed housing for internally displaced people. The last information that I have from 2021 was that 625 families would be compensated for their homes that had been destroyed. And the ministry was also guaranteeing 125 million hryvnia for the provision of temporary housing for IDPs. But I just want to give a sense here, this isn't so much a criticism as just you can see the difference between the scale of damage and destruction of homes and the scale of what the government had been able to make provisions for up until 2021. And I think this also speaks to Darina's presentation and this question of funding. The government already did not really have a lot of money being given to this problem. So it's something to, now that the scale is so much more astronomically huge, it's something further to consider. So I wanted to draw a little bit from a couple of interviews that I did with experts during this research in Ukraine, because I think they illustrate something really particular, which is the intersection of housing and economic security, because really, housing is related to jobs that people can have and the amount of money that people can have. So Irina Pavlik, who is an expert with UN Women, also pointed out that this has a gendered component. And we also need to keep in mind that when we're thinking about vulnerable populations here, there is a kind of gendered element to this. Single mothers are especially vulnerable. Women who experience gender-based violence are especially vulnerable. And so these are things that need to kind of connect with how we're thinking about future housing policy. So Irina Pavlik says the biggest challenge for IDPs is a lack of permanent accommodation. Renting housing is expensive and getting a good job is hard. These are the two first most common challenges, and they're interconnected. It's very hard to get a good job. And she mentions here that mining was often the predominant source of income for men in Donetsk Oblast. That's where they got better salaries, working in factories and plants. So for IDP women, it is really hard to get a good job, and that often gets them into being dependent on their partner or spouse or other family members. And that often leads to some manifestation of domestic and gender-based violence. So this economic component is linked. And I think this points out nicely, that not only are we talking about family situations that can be challenging, but women also are often receiving lower salaries than men. And so it can be really difficult, not to find a job that allows you to pay for your rent. And Irina Pavlik also shared some stories about discrimination in host communities against single mothers, for example. Renters wanted to rent to traditional looking families with two parents and children. And so these are, again, just sort of social components to think about when we're thinking about housing policy. And talking about Mariupol, I worked with Elena Stylovska, who worked with Caritas Mariupol, who also addressed this intersecting housing and economic problem. And she really looked at this, that people who were displaced to Mariupol and local people in Mariupol actually shared economic problems, because the economic problems, as she says in this long quote, those economic problems existed before and up to the conflict. So even in the villages where there was no work, that was the main problem for them. And then when the conflict began, the problem became much worse. So the problem, though, that she differentiates is that displaced people have a housing problem that the local population doesn't have. Local population has their own housing. So as she says, we have a lot of people who lived in Donetsk. In Donetsk, they were middle-class people. They had middle-class homes and cars, and they lost everything when they moved to Mariupol, and they lost this economic security. So now they're living paycheck to paycheck, and they lose their housing security, and there's no state program, as she pointed out, to help support people's lack of economic security there. So again, and of course, Mariupol is, obviously the situation has changed dramatically, but this is something that I think is important to think about in new host communities, is this economic question. Is it sustainable for host communities that are, again, receiving large numbers of internally displaced people? How are they going to be able to have economic security in order to be able to have housing security? These were problems that these international organizations were thinking about and trying to help the government develop policy on up until 2021. But again, returning to this problem of scale, now the scale is dramatically different. So I'll go ahead and wrap up just with a couple of key issues that the Ukrainian government faced in 2021 that are still things that are a problem now, that are probably, arguably much worse now. First of all, this lack of unified database on damaged and destroyed housing. And for that reason, I'm so grateful for the Kyiv School of Economics and the work that Darina just presented on, because I think that information is already much better than the information that existed up until now. So that's really a huge contribution. The second issue is this lack of clarity around opportunities for IDPs with respect to their housing security. So people lack knowledge of how the government can help them, if it can help them at all. And so something more systematic, although as we also, as some of the participants have rightly pointed out, not every community can be treated in the same way. So we have to think about how to differentiate access to policies, aid-based policies. Like I said before, this lack of economic security for IDPs contributes to housing insecurity. So thinking about rebuilding industry and economic opportunities at the same time that we're physically rebuilding people's homes. And then this problem of status, at the same time that IDPs were trying to integrate into their host communities, they were forced to keep their IDP status in order to keep their claim on their property in the temporarily occupied territories. And this is something that, my program recently published a report by Martina Urbanati that I can share a link to for anyone who's interested, about this problem of status, where basically the government policy was creating a condition in which people remained displaced. Officially, their status was displaced, even if they were well integrated into a host community and had no intention to return. And that has a lot to do with claims on housing. So now that there are so many more internally displaced people, the Ukrainian government must really think seriously about this particular status and what it means and how it's connected to questions like housing. I'll go ahead and stop there. Happy to share these slides, and my program will be publishing some more reports on this topic for anybody who's interested, and I welcome your questions. Thank you so much. Дякую за увагу.
Дякую, Емілі. Дякую за те, що не тільки...
Thank you, Emily, and thank you very much for not giving us the statistics and information and how you have been provided with housing, but you've also had some really interesting insights from the experts that you have interviews with, and it was definitely very interesting. I think that's we'll have the next question, Emily, if that's okay. If we will evaluate the work of government and the donors, because we have seen it even in Darina's slides, yet that's not just about the government that has been providing the housing, it's also the donors, and donors have even a significant parts than government sometimes. If we will evaluate the government's work and the donors' work in the last 8 years, how would you evaluate that? And if we will take the results and of their work, and if we will consider the destruction of 2014 and the destructions of 2022, and if we will be continuing the approach that we had, whether we will be able to manage to cover it fully.
Yeah, this is, I'll just answer in English if that's okay with everyone. It's a little easier. Yeah, it's a good question. Most of the experts that I spoke to were pretty critical of how long it took the government to make a policy at all. It was really, many of them talked about how each different branch, each different ministry didn't really want to take on the problem of internal displacement and would toss it to a different ministry. So I'm sure many of our audience members know that the Ministry for the Reintegration of the Temporarily Occupied Territories was previously called something else and was previously part of the Ministry of Veterans Affairs and previously something else. And so this there are huge bureaucratic hurdles to this. So most of the experts that I spoke to were highly critical of how the government had handled this, and really, considered that they had, to be frank, failed at doing their jobs here. Part of the reason for that is because so much of the response to internal displacement was from international organizations. It wasn't from the government. It was from people who, ordinary people in the host communities who received people, helped them find housing. I mean, they would, take over dormitories and create temporary housing for them. And so it's not until much, much later that the government intervenes. And so in that way, generally the assessment is that the government did a poor job. But when the war began, the government, I would say, was trying harder than it had before. So to some extent, we can't really know if continuing exactly the existing policy is the right choice, because we don't really know how that policy would have, unfolded, unfortunately.
Дякую. Дякую, Емілі.
Thank you, Emily. We have lots of questions, and some of the questions that were mostly concerning the panels that we're about to have later on. And David has mentioned we're going to have 2 more panels. We're not going to raise those questions today. We're going to raise them later. But some of the questions are concerning our next speaker, Alexander Anisimov. So I think that I would like to pass the floor to Alexander, because Alexander is the coordinator of the new housing policy project that is a partnering organization for the Blossoming Coalition. So he's going to tell us about the vision of how the reform is going to be how the system is going to be reformed and what it is what we would like to go to. So Alexander, please, the floor is yours. Alexander, I think we've lost you from the panel. We would like to ask our technical team to help us to find him out. You know, he was brought out of the, I think he's just trying to rejoin us again. He left the conversation. It's okay, so let us wait for Alexander to return.
If we get stuck, David will sing his back catalogue. So hopefully Alexander will come on very quickly.
David sympathizes with Alexander. Many is the time I have tried a screen share only to cancel an entire Zoom meeting.
Svetlana has indicated Alexei.
While we wait, Alexei, if you have another question for Emily until Alexander gets back, that would be promising.
Svetlana has her hand up.
Okay.
Світлана, будь ласка.
Yes, please, Svetlana. Yes, so David, Derek, Alexei, I'm pleased to welcome you all. It's a pleasure for me to see all of you here because, you know, we have been working on quite a problematic issues together for quite a long period of time. And using this pause that we now have with Alexander, I just wanted to say that the critique that we have heard on the side of the government, this is something that we're really considering. We know that there was a huge problem for all of us. I am myself an IDP, even though I haven't applied for the status. You know, I've left Donetsk in 2011 and I've got my parents, got my families there. And I do know how it feels when you're just trying to reintegrate in a new community. So when I was working on the state policy for 8 years already, there's one thing that I wanted to use this chance and ask the international community about this experience on the housing policy in this situation, on improving the housing policies as well. And with Alexander, who's going to be our next speaker, we're working together on that. And right now, the most important institution that supports the IDPs is to create the municipal housing funds. So basically, through this period, when the person is going to be assimilating in the community, while the person is looking for a job, while they're going to become a part of the community, when they're going to understand where they would like to live, we understand that what we need in Ukraine is the municipal housing that we have to now restore as well. Understanding that the number of the internally displaced persons since the military actions broke out has now increased at least by 50. So I really would like to have a separate conversation with your institute on, first of all, developing the legal framework and the normative regulation framework and on the financial mechanisms as well. And having this chance, I've already announced these moments and emphasized these problems. And I think that Nataliya, in her presentation, needed to voice that out as well. But unfortunately, he had some technical problems. And then we've had the air raid siren here as well. So she was not able to stay for a longer period of time here. I'm definitely ready to provide you with maybe some offers or commands, because you have addressed me with an issues about facilitating the construction permissions and providing the permissions for the landlords. We are all working in the Ministry of Regional Development, and we are now working on the most of the bylaws and draft laws. And I would like to ask the organizers to provide their offers and maybe to provide the international experience on the municipal housing fund creation. And I can see that Alexander is back. And, you know, having this moment while you have been away, I've used this moment to address our community. So thank you very much for your attention. Yes, thank you, Svetlana. You have definitely been the very good delight for our pause. But Alexander, the floor is yours, please. But you have to unmute yourself, of course.
Так, чи бачите ви презентацію?
Так, ми бачимо презентацію. Супер, будь ласка.
Я
See
перепрошую.
a presentation. Thank you. Yes, I know. Unfortunately, I had my lights out. So, you know, we had an air raid siren. It might have been some kind of a blast nearby. So I have no lights. So right now I'm back at your conference via my mobile phone. So hello, ladies and gentlemen, once again. I do hope that my internet connection will be okay for at least some time. My name is Alexander Anisimov, and I'm the project coordinator for the new housing policy project. And everything works with interpretation as well, I hope. Okay, good. So today I would like to discuss some of the conceptual ideas about the housing policy that are the ones that require our attention. And I've heard just the end of what Svetlana has said, and we have met each other at the forum that has been organized by our initiative just recently. But basically, I would like to start from this spatial issue as well, because, you know, I have the background in urban planning, and basically, I would like to start with this territory that is near Kiev in Ukraine. So this is one of the districts that is called Sofiev-Borshahivka. That's formally is a village, but after the communities have been united, they are now the amalgamated territorial community. They're also a part of the Kiev agglomeration. And formally, that's a fully autonomous community with their own rules, with their own authorities. But what I wanted to outline here, the starting to those to year 2005 and how the systems of the city construction was, for example, that wasn't, it generated a very specific environment in those districts. So, you know, it's non-functional environment that's even less functional than the traditional Soviet district planning. They don't have the integration of the public transport. It's not connected to any other city fabrics. We don't have sea, no of the green zones. We don't have lakes. We don't have parks. We don't see any leisure places. So 80% of this territory is basically covered by the residential buildings. So we understand that the private capital didn't build the needed social functions in these territories. And understanding those aspects, we know that those is the result of some certain mistakes, but on the other hand, that is also the result of passing the responsibility for the housing construction to the private developers. The community that was led by the mayor at that point, they received certain preferences, they received certain profits. But speaking about the long-term environmental perspectives, what we've lost was a great opportunity for the city to be developed and to provide the integral developments, to turn out into the effective city environment and so on and so forth. So again, the problem is it's not that it has been a result of the lack of policy or how the policy has built or implemented, but it is about providing the leverage of creating the urban environment to the private developers. One of the aspects is also that all of those houses, they're basically just the same on their social and economical component. So this is the housing that the people are investing their money and they want to own it. They don't have the municipal housing, they don't have the rented apartments, we don't have a separate housing for example, vulnerable groups of populations. So we don't have housing that is presupposed for the young families and for the students, so and others. So all of this housing creates additional problems instead of resolving the problems. These people cannot perform any other functions in the places they live, and it doesn't build up the social securities for the other people, for the other group of population other than the owners of these houses. So this is just the spatial and social aspect that used to be practiced in Ukraine before the war, and we will show that it will continue if we'll not have the fundamental changes after the war. Maybe that will be in a different state, but in the essence of it, we will have the very same situation continued. Quite recently, there was a publication from the shift directives that the shift teams is offering some new perspectives and some new points of view of what is going on with the housing right now. And this topic of turning the residential housing into some kind of products that everyone believes to be the economical assets for investment, for sales, for profit, to rethink it, because to understand that housing should be human-oriented as well. And I would outline these two main moments about this problem. The one would be the equitability. I don't know how to translate it in the right way into Ukrainian. So basically, we're talking about the social justice in a way, or economical justice in a way, or actually, we're talking about compatibility as well. And the other issue that would be the sustainability or the sustainable development. The first issue of equitability, that is basically that the right for housing is the right that we all have. And the most important thing for us is how can we exercise this right? And unfortunately, we don't have the good conditions to do that in Ukraine. And especially, there wasn't that good before the war, and it didn't turn out better now. The second issue, that by implementing and exercising our right to housing, we're not going to take away our future. Like, for example, as the people in the Sofia Borshehivka has taken, because they have taken away the opportunities to create a socially diverse district. But we really would like to build up this kind of housing environment so that the future generations could blossom. I have outlined the four main points that are needed to be resolved in order for us to be able to reach the more equitable and just housing and construction system. The first point would be about the creating and an efficient land politics that will help the local budget to manage their land properly, to value their land properly, to understand and acknowledge that their land is not just the source for the income, but is something that you have to take care about. That's something that you have to preserve as natural territories, the territories for education and leisure. And you need to tax those projects. You need to tax your investment that have the commercial component to it. You have to tax them properly. And as you know, that the land tax is not really good. It's evaluating only the area of the land lots, but not about the value of the land. So it is really cheap compared to the international taxes. And what is very important, that this resource can be the key tool for us to support the creation of the social projects in the city. And that can, for example, help us to do the point number 3, to create this municipal rental housing. We will need to have the billions of investment to do that, even in the new cities, to launch this system. We need to have this money, the land banks or the land foundation, they can also use that for the municipal fund. Another point is to provide the legal and institutional support for the non-profit housing. In Ukraine, we do not have that. We do not have this division between the non-profit and profit housing, because basically the monetization of the developers, and those are the construction sector, is basically economically profitable and economically attractive. So we don't have any other variations of the housing sector. We only have the for-profit organizations. We don't have the non-profit associations, housing associations. We don't have either on the planning level or at the local level of legislation any kind of support for this kind of construction office on this kind of legal opportunities that have been actually outlined throughout the years because there have been some legal problems and there had been a lot of legal bureaucracy connected to that. But this is something that would give us an opportunity to diversify the markets in the future and to create additional opportunities for using or owning the housing in the future. The third element that is important as well, which considers the establishment for the municipal rental housing systems, because we will then understand the value of the social housing. We will understand that the housing that exists in the city, it gives additional opportunities for the cities. So when you're renting it out, then you're not only creating the social pillar, you're also providing the future for the people, and you're also supporting multiple social groups in the possible marginalization. And another story that has been ignored in Ukraine for a longer period of time is that we have the new forms of this bono construction, the so-called housing complexes that are renting out the big territories. They're not integrated into the city fabrics and not creating any additional values. They're not creating additional social connections for those territories. And they're in their social and economical content, they're just the same. So that is why we have this, we're actually creating this oasis of richness in a quite poor Ukrainian cities due to that. And in order to prevent that, we need to use the social zoning. We need to have the social mixing in those zones. We need to put it in the front line in the first place. And we used to consider that we need to have a mix of rented housing, of the social or municipal housing in those residential complexes as well. About the sustainability, there's also the important points that we do to cover that. The first of all is working with the land use and proper land use. You know this, we had those dreams about the summer house that we used to have since the end of 80s. That has been a very important dream for Ukrainians and for all of the people all around the Eastern Europe. So we have to work about the land appropriation, of course, because most of the communities, they don't have this free land available because there's also a constant competition for that. It can be for the agricultural use, for the renewables, it can be used for, I don't know, the landscape park, or can be used for the industrial production. But in our case, we can easily take land and you can easily get the land and you can easily get the land constructed ineffectively. So then we have to fight that. We have to fight that as much as possible, and we will have to do that so that I don't know how to translate it into Ukrainian, but actually the new land take in the cities should be prohibited. Only the reusing of the available territories. On the other hand, there's also this question about the sustainability assessment that exists in Ukraine is not an effective tool about controlling the planning and existing documents. That's one of the other important notions where the city and the municipal actors, that they can control the quality and they control the sustainability of the construction. But unfortunately, in the current legislation, it is hard to be done. And we have to rethink of that as well. And we need to launch the system that will help us to provide the water connection to the water grid, connection to the public transports, and to provide the energy efficiency usage as well. The final 2 points is about the state functions, about how the state should redirect its money and its funds. In my point of view, the key investment should be held and should be directed into the main idea so that the municipal enterprises would receive the long-term credits from the state, from the international funds, to be able to create the sustainable energy efficient projects, the projects that will not require additional subsidies or dotations in the end, but maybe it even could create the surplus of the energy production. So, and of course, we will continuing working on the additional subsidies from coal and gas, and it will definitely depend on whether we will be able to shift from the systematic dotation and to turn into proactive market and to use this investment into alternative energy and infrastructure. But trying to close, and the main key important things that what we need is, I have worked in the municipalities, but what we do not have, we don't have this capacities to manage this kind of a system. And of course, like for example, in Lviv, we have quite progressive changes that we have seen in the global policies and in the way we're managing the assets that we have. But Ukrainian cities, they're quite away from all of those principles. We are not ready to implement all of those changes and dreams to turn them to life, try to actually get these projects throughout us. Creating this municipal housing market, it requires the re-evaluations of the tasks of the housing departments and the housing offices that have to turn into different functionality and have to deal with very different tasks. Those are the big challenges that our municipalities are not capable to cover now. We have to understand that as well. So this question requires education. This question requires the competences that have to be provided to the municipalities. And we understand that it also requires the inter-municipal collaboration that is not that widely spread in Ukraine. It has to be one of the big priorities for the activities of the state and the Ministry of Regional Development in order for the municipalities to be capable of doing that. Together with the municipality, by the municipalities, they have to be able to implement these policies from the level of the state. Alexander, I'm sorry, I'm really grateful, but we have to close the session already. Yes, but otherwise we will have the problems with the housing for IDPs. We will not have the good conditions. We will have environmentally destructive for the future of the state. But we have to work with that if we would like to invest into that as well. Thank you. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Alexander, for a very interesting presentation. Thank you so much. I really loved the beginning that you've had with the Sofia Borshagivka, and I really liked what you've said, what should be the final approach to that as well. We have a couple of minutes left, just around 5 minutes that we have left. We can now take a couple of questions or comments from our participants. So please, if you have any questions or comments, in order to do that, you either need to raise your hand or to write it in the chat. If we have no comments, then we had a question written before. We had a question for Alexander, whether the new housing policy also includes the new approaches to the industrial zoning. When in the industrial zoning, we will also have the civil housing. That's a very good question. If we still have the representatives of the Ministry of Regional Development here with us, well, from what we know right now, that we're developing these documents right now, and we know that at this very moment, the permission, they do not allow us to get the full understanding of what is the multifunctional territories would be. So basically, somehow the housing can be included into some of the commercial objects as well. But the most progressive zoning right now will be the multi-leveled zones, where at the very same those zones we will have the quite industrial production, and for example the plant growing and the food growing, the residential housing, additional cultural functions. So basically that's the most progressive approach to that. So and it's not about this very specific zoning that has to be outlined in Ukrainian legislation. We know, but right now those are not basically going to the standards that we currently have. Those are the functions that haven't been reviewed right now in Ukraine. So, for example, we're talking about, for example, the logistics functions or the non-hazardous industrial production that can be placed in the residential districts as well. But this is something that is very important when we're talking about the communities that will be developed, or about these assets that can be built by the IDPs because they would like to get back to their housing. I do believe that it's a very good opportunity for them to create additional value for the places where they currently reside, is to create their own communities and build their own integrity as well. Yes, I'm sorry for interrupting you, because I understand that we have to close our panel at this moment, and I would like to thank all of our panels. I know that due to the air raid siren, we didn't have this opportunity to listen clearly to the Deputy Minister presentation, and I do hope that our next sessions we will be able to catch up with that as well. Just briefly from my side, what I have seen from Ukrainian government, they're now using a different approach to the policies. And right now we already have some of the draft laws that have been provided on the construction norms as well, and on the methodology to evaluate the damages, for example, what Darina has mentioned. So we have seen that already with the ongoing war, government is thinking of what we should do to restore and rebuild housing fund in the future. And it's also about this initiative that Darina represents that is very important on gathering and collecting the information about the damage that has been done. I really want to thank Dmytro as well for his important notions and what he has highlighted, that we have to preserve the ecosystem as well, because you can provide the housing to the IDP, but you have to also understand whether they're one community. We have to preserve not just the housing, but the community as well, because this is about the values as much as it's about the housing. And I really want to thank Emily for having this outlook that she has given to us, and the critical evaluation of the actions of Ukrainian government. And I do share this opinion starting from 2014. Her conclusions are intertwined with what Darina has told us about as well. And I'm really happy that at this very moment we have the work conducted on noting down the damages, that we're working on the methodology of the damage evaluation, so that we will have different approaches to this phase when we're going to start rebuilding Ukraine. And we're really grateful to Alexander for his participation as well, giving us a clear example of Sofia Borshahivka district. People who have lived in Kiev, they know these issues when we have a separate city that is not integrated into cities infrastructure, and this equitability approaches that are the most important that you have highlighted. And it's, that not that much about the financial approaches, but more about being human. And I do believe that this human-orientedness in Ukraine is terrible in this case, and the issues of the municipal housing is really relevant because we've almost lost all of it and we're not dealing with it as of today. So I do believe that as for the opening panel, we have really outlined those challenges and issues that we're currently facing, and we have drawn the main pathway for us to keep on moving forward. Thank you very much, dear panelists, and I'll pass the floor for David for closing.
In the midst of an air warning, in the midst of power shutdowns caused by the war, this panel has just, and the audience and all the questions, has just spent 95 minutes talking about the future and how the future will be better than the past. In this first panel, we have tried to hit all of the themes that make housing complex and essential. I put up here that a week from today, we will dig deeper into the challenge of rebuilding better, smarter, faster, fairer. We have established a new rule that anyone who has to vacate her office in the midst of a presentation due to an air warning gets an invitation back. So both the Deputy Minister and Madam Startseva, who ably filled in, will be on the panel next week. Same exact time, we will get registration information to everybody. 2 weeks from hence, we're going to talk about refugees, IDPs, and a category that was not mentioned, families that are dispersed in multiple different places. The rehousing of Ukraine will be unlike anything that has happened in human history, because we are dealing for the first time with a 21st century globally connected dispersed population, where at the same time the property is being destroyed, the amount of property that's being destroyed is being counted. We plan on the far side of the World Urban Forum to have at least 2 more conferences beyond the ones listed there, one potentially on the multiple levels of government, and the second one all about a vision of a reform system. In doing this, we are doing this in service to the people and the families and the households of Ukraine. We are guided in this initiative by what you give us as input as to what you think is valuable. I put my email up there. I read them. If they come in Ukrainian, I will get someone to translate them. I thank everyone for attending and staying long. I especially thank our panelists and Alexei Filiv, our unbelievably able and gracious moderator from INTEGRITES. Thank you all and good day.